Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're gonna dim the lights, settle into our most comfortable spot, and let our minds drift back to a time when the world was a little more mysterious. We're going to explore some of the wonderfully bizarre, occasionally tragic, and often just plain weird superstitions that medieval people, from the lowliest peasant to the mightiest king, took as absolute gospel. So go ahead and grab that cozy blanket, maybe a warm drink, and let's just gently float into the past. Our journey begins, perhaps fittingly, with a deep dive into the everyday anxieties that shaped the medieval mind. It's easy for us, with our smartphones and science, to look back and chuckle at some of their beliefs, but for them, these weren't quaint customs. They were often matters of life and death, or at least severe misfortune. And really, who wants severe misfortune? Nobody, that's who. One of the big ones, and honestly still a bit of a thing even today, was the fear of Friday the 13th. Now, in the Middle Ages, this wasn't just about a scary movie franchise. The number 13 was already seen as unlucky, mostly because there were 13 people at the Last Supper, and, well, one of them wasn't exactly a team player. Combine that with Friday, which was the day Jesus was crucified, and you've got yourself a double whammy of bad vibes. People would genuinely avoid starting journeys, getting married, or even signing important documents on this day. Because why tempt fate when fate was already feeling a bit touchy, right? Imagine trying to run a kingdom when half your advisors are hiding under their beds because it's Friday the 13th. Productivity must have just plummeted. Then there was the whole ordeal with sneezes. Now, we just say bless you out of habit, but its origins are rooted in a very medieval concern. The belief was that your soul could actually escape your body when you sneezed, a brief involuntary expulsion of your very essence. And naturally, if your soul popped out for a quick breath of fresh air, something less desirable, like a demon, could just waltz right in and take up residence. So, God bless you, or Gesundheit, good health, was a quick invocation to slam that spiritual door shut before any unwelcome squatters moved in. It was basically a verbal bouncer for your soul. Of course, if you sneeze in with your mouth open, that was even worse, because it was like leaving the front door wide open for all sorts of spiritual riffraff. Speaking of doors and entrances, thresholds were absolutely rife with superstition. You never ever stepped on the threshold of a house when entering or leaving. It was seen as a boundary between worlds, a sacred liminal space, and disrespecting it could invite all sorts of spirits, both good and bad, to mess with your day. Some even believed that fairies resided in the threshold, and you certainly didn't want to annoy the local fae folk, because they were notorious for holding a grudge, and honestly, their pranks were just annoying. So, people would carefully step over the threshold, a little hop, a skip, or a carefully measured stride. Imagine the sheer concentration required just to walk into your own home every day. It truly makes you appreciate automated sliding doors, doesn't it? And if you were ever feeling a bit under the weather, forget your modern medicine. The medieval approach was far more imaginative. Take, for instance, the belief in sympathetic magic. This was the idea that like affects like, or that things that looked similar had similar properties. So if you had a problem with your eyes, you might try to cure it by rubbing them with something round, like an onion, because eyes are round, and onions, well, they're also round, sometimes. Or if you had a fever, you might sleep with a red cloth, because red was seen as a hot color, and maybe it would just absorb all that excess heat from your body. It sounds a bit like trying to fix a leaky roof with a colander, but they truly believed in it. It was a kind of proto-medicine, albeit one based more on vibes and visual puns than anything else. The moon, naturally, played a huge role in medieval superstitions. It was seen to govern not just the tides, but also human sanity, fertility, and even the growth of crops. The word lunacy, after all, comes from luna, the Latin word for moon. People genuinely believed that a full moon could drive you mad, which, honestly, some of us can still relate to after a particularly stressful week.
Farmers would plant and harvest according to the moon phases, believing that certain crops would thrive better if sown during a waxing moon and harvested during a waning moon. It was an astronomical calendar for everything, from getting a haircut to getting married. Because obviously you wouldn't want to get a bad haircut just because the moon was in the wrong quarter. That would be just devastating. Black cats, of course, were the ultimate bad luck charm. In medieval Europe, they became associated with witchcraft and evil, often believed to be witches' familiars or even demons in disguise. If a black cat crossed your path, it was a sure sign of impending doom. And if you happened to own a black cat, well, you might find yourself looking at a very awkward conversation with the local witch hunter. It's a tragic story, really, for what are otherwise perfectly lovely, albeit sometimes a bit aloof, creatures. This fear led to some rather unfortunate events for black cats throughout history, all because of some rather intense human anxieties about the unknown. Mirrors, too, held a dark fascination. Breaking a mirror was, as we still hear today, 7 years of bad luck. This belief stems from the idea that mirrors not only reflect your image, but also capture a piece of your soul. So, when you smashed a mirror, you were essentially shattering a part of yourself, or at least your spiritual doppelganger. And 7 years, that was considered the length of a human life cycle, meaning you'd be living under that shadow of misfortune for a complete cycle of your existence. It made people incredibly careful around mirrors, which, given the quality of medieval glass, was probably a good idea anyway. Imagine trying to explain to your spouse that the reason your crops failed for 7 years was because you dropped the looking glass. The medieval divorce courts must have been fascinating. Let's gently pivot now to some of the more bodily superstitions. The human body, being a rather mysterious and unpredictable vessel, was naturally the subject of much speculation. If your ears were ringing, it meant someone was talking about you. If your right ear was ringing, it meant someone was talking well of you.
Was good things. Left ear, bad things. So you'd find people frantically trying to figure out who was gossiping about them, or at least who was saying nice things. And if your palm itched, that meant money was coming your way. Right palm, money coming in. Left palm, money going out. This led to a lot of discreet palm scratching in the hopes of manifesting some much-needed coin. It was like a medieval, less reliable stock market indicator, printed right on your hand. Another common belief centered around spilled salt. Spilling salt was considered incredibly bad luck, partly because salt was a valuable commodity, and wasting it was seen as tempting fate. But also, it was believed that salt had purifying properties, and spilling it meant you were letting evil spirits into your space. The remedy? Throw a pinch of it over your left shoulder, because that's where the devil was said to reside. It was a quick, salty deterrent, a spiritual splash of cold water to ward off any lurking malevolence. Imagine being at a medieval banquet, accidentally knocking over the salt cellar, and then having to awkwardly throw salt over your shoulder while everyone stares. The sheer social pressure. And then we have the rather charming belief in love potions. Oh yes, people were absolutely convinced that certain concoctions could make someone fall madly in love with you, or at least intensely fond of you. These potions often contained a rather dubious mix of herbs, animal parts, and sometimes even bits of the person you wanted to charm, like hair or fingernail clippings, because nothing says "I love you" quite like a beverage spiked with your own keratin. The effectiveness was, shall we say, debatable, but the desperation was real. It speaks to a time when matters of the heart were often intertwined with practical concerns of lineage, land, and survival, making any magical shortcut incredibly appealing. Let's just gently drift back to some of the more everyday magical thinking. A common peasant superstition involved horseshoes. Finding a horseshoe was considered incredibly good luck, especially if it was facing open end up, because that meant it was catching all the good luck. You'd nail it above your door, open end up, to protect your home from evil and bring prosperity, because obviously you wanted all that good fortune to flow into your house, not out of it. If you nailed it open end down, all the luck would just drain out, which was a rather unfortunate waste of a perfectly good piece of iron.
It was a simple, tangible way for people to feel like they had some control over their unpredictable world. Another simple yet widely held belief was in the power of certain stones and amulets. People would carry specific gems or charms, believing they had protective qualities, could cure illnesses, or bring good fortune. Amethysts, for instance, were believed to prevent intoxication, which probably came in handy at medieval feasts. Agate was thought to ward off lightning, and coral was supposed to protect children from evil spirits. It was like a medieval pharmacy and security system, all rolled into various shiny bits. And honestly, who wouldn't want a pretty stone that also promised to keep you from getting too tipsy? A win-win, really. Dreams, of course, were seen as far more than just random neural firings. They were often interpreted as omens, messages from God, or even glimpses into the future. Dream interpretation manuals were incredibly popular, helping people decipher the often bizarre imagery of their nocturnal adventures. Dreaming of a clear, flowing river might signify good fortune, while dreaming of murky, stagnant water could indicate impending trouble. And if you dreamt of losing a tooth, that was almost universally a bad sign, foretelling the death of a friend or relative. It made sleep a rather fraught experience, knowing your subconscious was constantly trying to warn you about things you probably couldn't even change. Let's just take a moment to consider the sheer volume of these everyday worries. Every shadow, every sneeze, every broken item, every phase of the moon could hold some hidden meaning, some coded message about impending good or ill fortune. It must have been exhausting trying to navigate a world so thoroughly saturated with potential pitfalls and magical worries.
Interventions. It speaks to a deep human need for meaning, for understanding, especially in a world that was often harsh, unpredictable, and medically bewildering. The fear of witches and witchcraft, of course, permeated medieval society. This wasn't just a superstition. It evolved into a terrifying legal and social phenomenon. Witches were believed to possess supernatural powers, often granted by the devil, which they used to cause harm. Everything from spoiling crops to cursing livestock to causing illness or death. The belief was so deeply ingrained that accusations of witchcraft could, and often did, lead to trials, torture, and execution. It was a devastating consequence of fear and scapegoating, where isolated, often vulnerable individuals became the targets of collective anxiety. The remedies for suspected witchcraft were as varied as the accusations themselves. People would hang protective charms in their homes, like dried herbs, specific stones, or even written prayers, hoping to ward off evil spells. If someone was believed to be bewitched, various counterspells or rituals might be performed by local cunning folk who were seen as having their own, more benevolent magical abilities. It was a constant battle against unseen forces, a perpetual state of vigilance against malevolent energies. And sometimes you just wanted to make sure your milk didn't sour, which was a very real problem in those days. Then there was the superstition around bells. Church bells, in particular, were believed to have protective powers. Their ringing was thought to drive away evil spirits, avert storms, and even break spells. When a storm approached, villagers would often ring the church bells vigorously, believing that the sound would disperse the thunderclouds and prevent lightning strikes. It was a sort of acoustic ward, a sonic shield against the unpredictable fury of nature. And it probably also served to rally the community, giving people a sense of shared action in the face of fear. Plus, a good loud clang always helps when you're trying to scare away demons, right? And what about the fascinating, if slightly grim, superstitions surrounding death? Death was a constant presence in medieval life, and people had numerous beliefs about how to ensure a peaceful passing and protect the living from the lingering presence of the dead. One belief was that if a dying person struggled excessively, it was because they had some unfinished business or unconfessed sin. Family members might try to prompt confessions or fulfill wishes to ease the person's transition. It was an attempt to bring order and meaning to the messy, often agonizing reality of dying.
Another common practice involved covering mirrors in a house where someone had died. This was done to prevent the deceased soul from becoming trapped in the mirror, or to prevent living family members from seeing the ghost of the departed in the reflection. It was a way to respectfully mark the boundary between life and death, and to ensure that the soul moved on unimpeded. And honestly, seeing a ghostly reflection of your recently deceased loved one wouldn't exactly be a calming experience, so perhaps a practical measure as well. Let's gently transition to the world of medieval royal courts, where superstitions weren't just the domain of peasants, but were woven into the very fabric of power and politics. After all, if anyone had a vested interest in warding off bad luck and ensuring good fortune, it was the people whose entire lineage and legacy depended on it. Consider the obsession with relics. Royals and nobles would go to extraordinary lengths and expense to acquire fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, or any object touched by a holy figure. These weren't just symbols of piety, they were believed to possess tangible power, to heal, to protect, to ensure victory in battle, and to legitimize their rule. A king who possessed a particularly potent relic was seen as divinely favored, and therefore more legitimate. It was a kind of spiritual arms race, where collecting the holiest bits of the past could grant a very real advantage in the present. Imagine trying to explain your budget request for one genuine finger bone of St. Cuthbert to your medieval finance minister. And then there was the whole elaborate dance around coronations and royal blessings. The anointing of a king with sacred oil wasn't just a ceremony. It was believed to imbue him with divine grace, making him literally chosen by God. This made the king's body itself a kind of living relic, capable of performing miracles. English and French kings, for instance, were believed to have the power to cure scrofula, a lymphatic disease, by touch alone. They would hold special ceremonies where hundreds of sick people would line up to be touched by the monarch, hoping for a miraculous cure. It was a powerful display of both spiritual and temporal authority, even if the actual medical efficacy was, shall we say, a bit spotty. Let's consider the curious case of royal astrologers. Despite the church's often skeptical view of astrology, nearly every major monarch in medieval Europe had an astrologer on their payroll. These individuals weren't just reading horoscopes for fun. They were consulted on matters of state, military campaigns, and most importantly, royal marriages. No prince or princess was betrothed without consulting the stars to ensure a propitious union. Imagine the pressure on these astrologers. Get a bad reading, and you could potentially derail an entire dynastic alliance. And if things went wrong anyway, well, the stars were obviously aligned against them, or perhaps the astrologer just hadn't read the fine print. The birth of a royal heir was of course fraught with its own set of superstitions and anxieties. The gender of the child, the time of its birth, even the astrological signs under which it arrived, all were meticulously recorded and interpreted. A male heir born under a favorable constellation was seen as a sign of continued prosperity for the dynasty. A female heir, while still welcome, might cause a bit of a diplomatic scramble to arrange a strategic marriage. And if a royal child was born with any perceived imperfection, that could lead to immense consternation, whispered rumors of curses, or even, in more extreme cases, being quietly whisked away from public view. The pressure to produce perfect, healthy, politically advantageous offspring was immense, and every little hiccup could be interpreted as a divine warning. Royal funerals, too, were steeped in superstitious practice. The belief was that the proper observance of death rituals was crucial for the soul's passage to the afterlife and for the stability of the realm. Effigies of the deceased monarch were often paraded, sometimes even having food and drink placed before them, to ensure the continuity of the royal presence and to appease any lingering spirits. And the elaborate tombs and burial sites weren't just monuments.
To power, they were also seen as places where the living could commune with the sainted dead, seeking their intercession and protection.
It was a grand, theatrical display of both grief and a profound belief in the enduring power of the departed. Chapter 2. The Divine Mess of Royal Lineages and Holy Relics. The obsession with royal bloodlines was, in itself, a kind of grand, state-sponsored superstition. There was this prevailing idea that the blood of a king was fundamentally different from the blood of a commoner, richer, more potent, and somehow physically imbued with the right to rule. This led to the rather messy and, frankly, genetically disastrous practice of keeping it all in the family. They were so terrified of diluting the royal essence that they preferred to marry their cousins or even their uncles, because why look for a spouse across the border when there's a perfectly good relative sitting right across the dinner table? Of course, the irony is that in their quest to preserve the purity of their line, they often ended up with heirs who were increasingly frail, both in mind and body. But in the medieval mindset, a sickly king with the right blood was often preferred over a robust one with the wrong parents. It was a commitment to a biological brand that eventually, predictably, backfired. Let's float over to the concept of the king's evil again, but look at it from the perspective of the poor souls waiting in line. People would travel for hundreds of miles, often in terrible pain, just for a brief, fleeting touch from the monarch. The kings, for their part, would often hand out a touch piece, a gold or silver coin that had been blessed, to the sufferers. These coins weren't just currency, they were treated as powerful amulets. People would wear them around their necks for the rest of their lives, believing that the coin itself held a residual charge of royal divinity. It was essentially the medieval version of a signed celebrity photo, except instead of an autograph, you were hoping for a cure for your swollen lymph nodes. If the person didn't get better, it was rarely blamed on the king. Instead, it was assumed the patient lacked sufficient faith or had committed some secret sin that blocked the royal mojo. Because, of course, the king couldn't possibly be at fault. He was the king. The belief in the power of sacred objects extended far beyond the king's person. We have to talk about the trial by ordeal, which was a legal system based entirely on the idea that God would personally intervene in local court cases. If you were accused of a crime and there weren't enough witnesses, the court might decide to let God settle it. This usually involved something pleasant, like holding a red-hot iron bar or reaching into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a stone. If your hand healed without festering after a few days, you were innocent. If it got infected, well, clearly God was pointing a finger at you. It was a system that favored people with excellent immune systems and thick skin, literally. There was also the ordeal by cold water, where the accused was tied up and tossed into a pond. If they floated, they were guilty because the pure water was rejecting them. If they sank, they were innocent, though they might also be drowning, which was a bit of a hollow victory. It's the ultimate heads I win, tails you lose scenario, delivered with a shrug and a prayer. Even the architecture of the time was influenced by these protective anxieties. Have you ever noticed those bizarre, distorted faces carved at the corners of old cathedrals? We call them gargoyles or grotesques. While we see them as cool Gothic decorations, the medieval person saw them as spiritual lightning rods. The idea was that like repels like. By putting something scary and ugly on the outside of the church, you would frighten away the actual demons who were trying to get inside. It was basically a no dogs allowed sign, but for the forces of darkness. You'd have these holy spaces filled with incense and chanting, while on the roof, a stone monster with wings and a tongue sticking out was doing the heavy lifting of security. It was a very visual, very tactile way of understanding the battle between good and evil, a battle that apparently involved a lot of funny faces. Then there were the superstitions surrounding the humors of the body. Medieval doctors, and I use that term loosely, believed the human body was filled with four main liquids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. If you were feeling a bit cranky or under the weather, it was simply because your liquids were out of whack. This led to the widespread practice of bloodletting. If you had a fever, clearly you had too much blood, so the solution was just to drain some. They used leeches for the delicate work and a lancet for the bigger jobs. It's hard to imagine being already exhausted from a medieval flu and thinking, you know what I need? To lose a pint of blood. But people did it religiously. They even had phlebotomy calendars that told you which days were best for bleeding based on, you guessed it, the zodiac. You wouldn't want to bleed your liver when the moon was in Leo. That would just be asking for trouble. Let's shift our gaze to the weird world of medieval animal trials. Yes, you heard that right. If a pig wandered into a house and bit a child, or if a swarm of locusts ate a village's crops, the medieval solution wasn't just to deal with the animal, it was to take the animal to court. They would appoint a lawyer for the pig, read out the charges in the town square, and hold a full-blown trial. There were records of weevils being excommunicated by the church for damaging vineyards. The logic was that all creatures were subject to God's law, and if they misbehaved, they had to be legally and spiritually rebuked. Imagine being a defense attorney in the 14th century and having to argue that your client, a particularly stubborn goat, was acting in self-defense. It sounds like a comedy sketch, but they were deadly serious. It was all part of a world where everything had a place, a purpose, and a potential for demonic possession. The fear of the evil eye was another constant companion. It wasn't just a metaphor for jealousy. It was believed that some people could literally project a curse through a glance. This is why you see so many medieval charms shaped like hands or eyes, designed to reflect the glare back at the sender. Children and livestock were considered particularly vulnerable to the evil eye, so mothers would often hide their babies from strangers or dress them in drab clothes to avoid drawing too much attention. If a neighbor complimented your cow too much and then the cow stopped giving milk the next day, that wasn't just bad luck. That neighbor was definitely a blinker. It made for a very polite but also very suspicious social atmosphere. You had to be careful not to look too happy or too successful or too anything, really. Even the way people slept was dictated by superstition. Most people slept in a segmented fashion. They'd sleep for a few hours, wake up around midnight for an hour or two of quiet time, and then go back to sleep. This middle period was seen as a time of high spiritual activity. It's when you'd pray, reflect on your sins, or maybe just worry about the noises in the thatch.
It was also believed that you should never sleep flat on your back, as that was the position of a corpse and might invite the night hag, a demon believed to sit on people's chests and steal their breath. This is actually a very old explanation for sleep paralysis, but back then it was a very real, very physical threat. So people huddled together, propped up by pillows, hoping to stay just upright enough to stay alive. Speaking of staying alive, the medieval kitchen was a minefield of omens. If you were baking bread and the loaf cracked across the top, it was a sign of a death in the family. If you dropped a knife, a man was coming to visit. Drop a fork, and it was a woman. Everything was a telegram from the future. Even the bubbles in your morning pottage could be interpreted if you were looking closely enough. It reveals a world where the mundane was never actually mundane. There was no such thing as a random occurrence. If your milk turned sour, it wasn't just bacteria. It was a curse or a sign of an impending storm, or perhaps a local fairy was feeling particularly spiteful that morning. Let's gently drift toward the concept of hallowed ground. The boundary between the churchyard and the rest of the world was incredibly sharp. Being buried in hallowed ground was the difference between eternal rest and being a restless spirit. This is why criminals or people who took their own lives were often buried at crossroads. The idea was that the cross shape of the roads would confuse their ghosts, preventing them from finding their way back to the village to haunt the living. They'd even drive a stake through the heart of the deceased, not because they thought they were vampires, but just to pin the soul to the spot. It was a very literal, very physical way of managing the afterlife. You didn't just pray for the dead, you took architectural precautions against them.
Consider the role of the sin ear. In some regions, when a person died, a professional sin eater, usually the poorest, most marginalized person in the village, would be brought in. A piece of bread and a bowl of ale would be placed on the chest of the corpse. The sin eater would eat the bread and drink the ale, and in doing so, they would symbolically eat the sins of the deceased, taking the spiritual burden onto their own soul so the dead person could go to heaven. It was a grim, lonely profession. The sin eater was often shunned by the community because they were seen as being bloated with the accumulated sins of the entire village. It was a heavy price to pay for a crust of bread, but for the grieving family, it was a necessary superstition to ensure their loved one's peace. The medieval world was also obsessed with the idea of monstrous births in the animal kingdom. If a calf was born with 2 heads, it wasn't seen as a genetic fluke, it was a divine newspaper headline. Such events were meticulously recorded by chroniclers and interpreted as warnings of impending war, famine, or the death of a king. There was a whole science of portents. If a whale washed up on a beach, it meant a change in the papacy. If a swarm of bees settled on a dead tree, it meant a bad harvest. It's as if the entire natural world was a giant, confusing billboard, and everyone was trying to squint and read the fine print before the next disaster hit. We should also mention the curious habit of telling the bees. This was the belief that bees were a vital link between our world and the spirit world. If a death occurred in the family, someone had to go out to the hives and whisper the news to the bees. If you didn't, the bees might get offended, stop making honey, or even die of grief. People treated their beehives like respected, if slightly judgmental, members of the household. You'd even drape the hives in black cloth during a funeral. It's a strangely sweet superstition, imagining a medieval farmer leaning over a wooden hive to update the insects on the local gossip and family tragedies. As we move deeper into the night, let's consider how these beliefs weren't just for the uneducated. The most brilliant minds of the age were often the ones most committed to these ideas. Think of the alchemists who spent their lives trying to turn lead into gold. This wasn't just greed, it was a deeply spiritual quest to find the philosopher's stone, a substance that would purify both matter and the human soul. They believed the universe was a giant puzzle left by God, and if you just mixed the right chemicals in the right order under the right planet, you'd unlock the secrets of immortality. It was a blend of chemistry, mysticism, and a lot of very expensive, very dangerous lab accidents. Of course, they never found the stone, but they did manage to accidentally discover things like phosphorus and sulfuric acid, which I suppose is a decent consolation prize for not living forever. And then there's the mandraga, or mandrake root. This plant has a root that vaguely looks like a human figure, and because of that, it was the subject of some of the most intense superstitions of the era. People believed that when you pulled a mandrake from the ground, it would let out a scream so piercing it would kill anyone who heard it. To get around this, they'd tie a dog to the plant, walk a safe distance away, and then blow a horn to startle the dog. The dog would pull the root, the mandrake would scream, the poor dog supposedly drop dead, and the humans would have their magical root. It's an incredibly elaborate and cruel process for a plant that was mostly just used as an anesthetic, but such was the power of a good, scary story in the Middle Ages. Chapter 3. The Unfortunate Anatomy of Royal Dynasties. When we think of kings and queens, we often imagine these towering figures of grace and power, but the reality was usually much more humid and often quite lumpy. Because of the aforementioned obsession with keeping bloodlines pure, the royal houses of Europe eventually became a very small, very strange social club where everyone was their own cousin. Take, for instance, the Habsburgs. You can't talk about royal disasters without the Habsburgs. They were a family that basically decided that the best way to maintain an empire was to marry people they already saw at Thanksgiving. The result was the famous Habsburg jaw. It wasn't just a strong chin, it was a structural catastrophe. By the time we get to Charles II of Spain, the genetics had essentially surrendered. Poor Charles was the product of generations of staying in the family. His mother was his father's niece, and his grandmothers were also his aunts. It was a family tree that looked more like a telephone pole. Charles was physically over-encumbered by his ancestry that he couldn't even chew his own food properly because his lower jaw protruded so far past his upper jaw.
1. His tongue was so large that his speech was barely intelligible, which is a bit of a setback when you're supposed to be the absolute voice of a global superpower. But the superstitions surrounding him were perhaps the most tragic part. Because he was so sickly and struggled to produce an heir, the court didn't think, maybe we should stop marrying our nieces. Instead, they decided he was bewitched. They called him El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. They subjected this poor man to endless exorcisms. They even brought in the exhumed corpses of his ancestors to sit in his room, hoping their royal essence would somehow jumpstart his vitality through sheer proximity. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep while the mummified remains of your great-grandfather are staring at you from the corner of the room. It's no wonder the man was a bit high-strung. Let's float over to the French court, which had its own unique brand of dysfunction. We often hear about the Sun King, Louis XIV, and his glittering palace at Versailles. But the reality of life there was less about golden carriages and more about the staggering lack of plumbing. Louis XIV famously only took about 3 full baths in his entire life, and that was mostly because his doctors forced him to. The belief at the time was that water opened the pores and allowed miasma, or disease, to enter the body. So instead of washing, the most powerful man in Europe would just change his linen shirt several times a day and douse himself in heavy perfume. The palace was a marvel of architecture, but it reportedly smelled like a mix of rotting lilies and an unwashed locker room. The king's health was a matter of intense public fascination, to the point of being a spectator sport. When Louis had a particularly troublesome fistula, let's just say it was a very uncomfortable royal seat issue, the entire nation went into a state of prayerful panic. After a surgeon successfully operated on him using a specially designed silver instrument, because of course, the surgery became a trend. Courtly nobles, in a desperate bid to be like the king, would pretend they also had the same ailment, just so they could receive the same fashionable medical attention. It's the ultimate example of, if the king has it, I want it too, even if it is an agonizing surgical procedure performed without anesthesia. Then there was the tragic life of Henry VI of England. Henry was a man who was deeply, profoundly unsuited for the job of being a medieval king. He was incredibly pious, very gentle, and had the mental fortitude of a damp biscuit. He inherited the throne as a baby, and by the time he was an adult, the pressure of the Wars of the Roses caused him to simply blink out. He suffered from a series of catatonic stupors where he wouldn't speak, move, or recognize anyone for over a year at a time. The court's reaction wasn't sympathy, but a mix of political maneuvering and superstitious dread. They believed his spirit had literally left his body, or that he was being punished for the sins of his grandfather. While Henry was staring blankly at walls, his wife, Margaret of Anjou, had to basically run the entire country while trying to convince everyone that her husband was just deeply meditating. It was a slow-motion car crash of a reign, where a man who probably just wanted to be a quiet monk was forced to wear a crown that was far too heavy for his spirit. Let's drift toward the east to consider the Romanovs in Russia, specifically the later years. The obsession with a male heir led them straight into the arms of Grigory Rasputin. Now, Rasputin is often portrayed as a dark sorcerer, but he was really just a very charismatic, very unwashed, holy man who happened to be at the right place at the right time. The young Tsarevich, Alexei, had hemophilia, the royal disease that had trickled down from Queen Victoria. In a world where a simple bruise could be fatal, the Empress Alexandra was desperate.
Rasputin's power likely came from his ability to calm the child down. When the boy was calm, his blood pressure dropped and the bleeding slowed. But to the Empress, it was a miracle. She believed Rasputin was a direct line to God. This caused a massive scandal, as the Russian nobility watched a peasant with food in his beard and a very questionable reputation, basically whispering into the ear of the Tsarina. It's a perfect example of how a private medical tragedy, fueled by a mother's desperation and a belief in the supernatural, could eventually help topple an entire 300-year-old empire. Speaking of Queen Victoria, she was the ultimate grandmother of Europe, and she unknowingly spread hemophilia through the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia like a genetically coded ticking time bomb. Victoria herself was a fascinating study in mournful superstition. After her husband Albert died, she went into a state of mourning that lasted 40 years. She wore black until the day she died, but more than that, she kept Albert's rooms exactly as they were the day he passed. Every morning, servants were required to bring hot water for Albert's shaving mug and lay out a fresh suit of clothes for a man who had been dead for decades. It was a ritualistic preservation of a ghost, a royal refusal to let the veil between life and death actually close. Let's move our attention to the Mad Queen of Castile, Juana. She's often remembered as Juana la Loca. Her story is one of the most heartbreaking instances of royal gaslighting in history. Juana was actually quite intelligent and lived in a very tumultuous time. When her husband, Philip the Handsome, who, ironically, was more handsome by title than by facial symmetry, died, Juana was devastated. The legends say she refused to let her body be buried and traveled across Spain with her coffin, opening it occasionally to kiss the feet of her decaying husband. While she was undoubtedly grieving, historians now suspect her father and later her son played up her madness to keep her locked away so they could rule in her stead. She spent decades imprisoned in a windowless room, listening to the bells of a nearby convent while the world moved on without her. It was a political assassination of her character, using the superstition of madness as the ultimate cage. The irony of all these royal lives is that for all their gold, all their divine right, and all their supposed holy protection, they were often the most miserable people in the room. They were trapped by their own blood, watched by thousands of judgmental eyes, and treated more like prize cattle than human beings. Their quirks weren't just personality traits, they were the symptoms of a system that valued the idea of a person more than the person themselves.
Consider the child kings of the medieval era. Being a royal child was a high-stakes gamble. You were a political pawn from the moment you could crawl. There was a belief that the innocence of a child king could bring a special kind of blessing to a realm, but in practice, it usually just brought civil war. These children were often sickly, overfed on rich foods their little bodies couldn't handle, and surrounded by advisors who were more interested in their own power than the child's education. Many of these children developed the rickets or other ailments due to being kept indoors for their own safety. They were literally precious to the point of being smothered. It was a world where a 5-year-old could be married off to a 20-year-old for the sake of a port city or a salt mine. The emotional meltdowns these children had were recorded by chroniclers not as tantrums, but as omens of the kingdom's future temperament. If the kid cried during his coronation, it meant a reign of sorrow. No pressure, right? As we settle further into our pillows, let's think about the sheer weight of that crown. It wasn't just gold and jewels, it was a heavy, invisible burden of expectations, superstitions, and the constant nagging fear that the stars might turn against you at any moment. The royal life wasn't a fairy tale, it was a long, slow, ornate struggle against biology, boredom, and the ever-present smell of unwashed velvet. Chapter 4. The Royal Stomach and the Alchemy of the Apothecary. If you think the politics of the Middle Ages were hard to digest, you should take a look at their dinner tables. For a royal, eating wasn't just about sustenance, it was a performance of wealth,
and, quite often, an exercise in extreme gastrointestinal bravery. The higher you were in the social hierarchy, the further removed your food had to be from anything resembling a vegetable. Vegetables were seen as lowly because they grew in the dirt, making them fit only for peasants. A king, being closer to God, needed to eat things that lived high up, like birds. This led to a diet consisting almost entirely of roasted meats, heavy sauces, and sugar. Lots and lots of sugar. By the time we get to the Tudor era in England, sugar was the ultimate status symbol. It was imported at great expense, so if you were rich, you put it on everything. They even had sugar plate, which was basically a medieval version of fondant used to build edible sculptures of castles and dragons. Queen Elizabeth I famously had a legendary sweet tooth, and because the concept of a toothbrush was still a few centuries away, her teeth eventually turned black. But because she was the queen, black teeth became a fashion trend. Aristocratic ladies would actually blacken their teeth with soot to look like they could afford as much sugar as the monarch. It's a wonderful example of how royal decay can become the height of high fashion. But this diet of meat and sugar had a predictable consequence: gout. Gout was known as the disease of kings, and it was essentially a painful inflammatory condition caused by a buildup of uric acid. Imagine your big toe feeling like it's being crushed by a hot iron, and then having to lead a cavalry charge. Henry VIII is the poster child for this. In his youth, he was a vibrant, athletic, golden prince, but as he aged and leaned into a diet of 13-course meals, he became so immobile that he had to be moved around his palaces in a trammeled chair, basically a royal forklift. His leg developed chronic weeping ulcers that the royal doctors tried to treat with things like pearl dust and roasted turnip poultices. The smell was reportedly so potent that you could tell the king was approaching from several hallways away. Of course, when the king's body started to fail, the superstitions surrounding his health reached a fever pitch. If the king had a bad night, the entire country felt the tremors. This led to some truly imaginative medical cures. One popular remedy for general malaise among the elite was usnea, which was a type of moss that grew on the skulls of criminals who had been left hanging in gibbets. The idea was that the vitality of the person's life, cut short, had been absorbed by the moss, so a royal physician might scrape some moss off a dead thief's head, mix it into a wine, and serve it to a prince. It's the kind of pharmacy that makes you realize why so many people preferred to just pray and hope for the best. Then there was the obsession of unicorn horn. Almost every major royal treasury in Europe claimed to own a piece of a unicorn's horn, which was actually the tusk of a narwhal sold by clever Viking traders. It was believed that a piece of this horn could detect and neutralize any poison. Since being poisoned was a top-tier occupational hazard for any monarch, they would have their cups made of unicorn horn, or have a piece of it dipped into their wine before drinking. If it bubbled, it was poisoned. Of course, it didn't actually work, but it gave the kings enough peace of mind to finish their dinner. It's a testament to the power of a good marketing campaign. Viking sailors essentially sold whale teeth for the price of a small province based purely on a myth. Let's float over to the concept of mummy powder. From the 12th century well into the Renaissance, crushed-up ancient Egyptian mummies were a staple in the royal medical cabinet. It was called mumia. People believed the bitumen used in the embalming process had miraculous healing properties, so for hundreds of years, the wealthy were essentially eating the ancient dead to cure their headaches and stomach aches. It got so popular that a black market emerged, where fresh corpses were being aged in the sun and sold as authentic ancient mummy, because the supply from Egypt couldn't keep up with the European demand for corpse dust smoothies. It's one of those historical facts that makes you want to go back in time just to hand them an aspirin. Even the way royals gave birth was a medical circus. When a queen was about to deliver, she was subjected to lying in, which involved being shut away in a room where every window and crack was sealed with heavy tapestries to keep out bad air and light. The room would be stiflingly hot, crowded with ladies in waiting, and filled with the smoke of holy incense. For weeks, the expectant mother would live in this dark, oxygen-deprived box. The idea was to create a safe womb-like environment, but in reality it was a breeding ground for germs and exhaustion. It's a miracle any royal heirs survived the birth chamber, considering the doctors weren't actually allowed to see or touch the queen due to modesty laws, often forced to work by feel under a large sheet.
And what about the golden water? Medieval uroscopy was the art of diagnosing every possible ailment by looking at the color, sediment, and even the taste of the patient's urine. Royal piss prophets would hold up a glass flask called a matula and peer at the contents with the intensity of a diamond appraiser. They had charts with 20 different shades of yellow, each indicating a different spiritual or physical problem. If it was the color of a bright sword, you were angry. If it was the color of a lion's tail, you had a fever. It was a very visual, very public way of managing the royal humors, though it rarely resulted in anyone actually getting better. As we move deeper into the night, think of the poor royal apothecaries tasked with creating these bizarre concoctions. They were essentially half chemists, half magicians. They'd spend their days grinding up emeralds, mixing them with the tears of a stag, which were actually just eye secretions, and adding a dash of gold leaf. Gold was seen as the most perfect metal, so naturally, eating it would make you more perfect. This is why you still see gold flakes in some fancy liqueurs today. It's a tiny, shimmering remnant of a time when people thought swallowing metal was a great way to live forever. The tragic irony of all this advanced royal medicine is that the peasants, who couldn't afford mummy powder or gold-infused wine, often fared better. They ate vegetables, they walked everywhere, and they didn't have a team of doctors trying to bleed them every time they caught a cold. The royal elite were essentially being pampered to death, surrounded by expensive cures that were often more toxic than the illnesses they were meant to treat. It was a life of gilded misery, where every sneeze was a state emergency, and every meal was a potential gout flare-up.
Thought to keep the court balanced, it was a cruel, objectifying practice rooted in a desperate need to categorize and control anything that fell outside the norm. As we settle deeper into our dreams, imagine the sounds of a royal palace at night. The scratching of greyhounds on the floorboards, the low growl of a lion in a nearby courtyard, the flutter of a falcon on its perch, and the whispered prayers of a king who wonders if his black-toothed queen is actually bewitched. It was a world where every creature, from the smallest bee to the largest elephant, was a character in a divine play, and every bark or chirp was a line of dialogue that had to be carefully decoded. Chapter 6. The exhausting spectacle of royal leisure. When a royal finally stepped away from the stress of being a living relic or worrying about the state of their urine, they didn't exactly relax in the way we understand it. There was no such thing as a quiet weekend end for a medieval or Renaissance monarch. Leisure was just another form of high-stakes theater, and it was often just as dangerous as going to war. Take, for example, the mask. These were incredibly elaborate, expensive costume parties where the king and his favorites would dress up as gods, nymphs, or personifications of virtue or plenty. The costumes were made of heavy velvet and wire, and the sets were lit by thousands of flickering candles. It was a recipe for disaster, and because why not add more risk, they often incorporated early pyrotechnics. One of the most tragic examples of royal leisure gone wrong was the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, in 1393. King Charles VI of France, who was already struggling with the belief that he was made of glass and might shatter if touched, decided to perform a dance with 5 of his friends. They dressed up as wild men in costumes soaked in resin and flax to make them look hairy. Because the king was glass, they were all chained together for safety. But someone brought a torch too close, and in an instant, the wild men were literally on fire. The king only survived because a teenage duchess threw her voluminous skirts over him to smother the flames.
The rest of the dancers weren't so lucky. It's a stark reminder that even a fun night out could turn into a national tragedy when your wardrobe is essentially a giant candle wick. When they weren't catching fire, royals were obsessed with the hunt. This wasn't just about getting dinner, it was a ritualized simulation of combat. They would spend all day chasing a single stag through the mud, believing that the way the animal died was a direct reflection of their own hunting prowess and the health of the land. If the stag put up a noble fight, it was a good sign for the kingdom. If it just gave up, it was seen as a bit of a letdown from the universe. They even had a ceremony called the breaking of the deer, where the monarch would perform the first cut on the carcass. It was a messy, bloody business, but in the medieval mind, it was the height of sophistication. And then there were the progresses. Imagine the entire royal court, thousands of people, horses, carts, and the royal bed moving across the country to visit the homes of wealthy nobles. For the monarch, it was a holiday. For the noble being visited, it was a financial catastrophe. Queen Elizabeth I was the master of this. She would show up at a manor house with her entire entourage and stay for weeks, effectively bankrupting her hosts through the sheer cost of feeding and entertaining her. The nobles would have to build new wings onto their houses or install elaborate fountains just to keep her amused. It was a way for the queen to keep her powerful subjects poor and busy, ensuring they didn't have the resources to start a rebellion. It was leisure used as a political weapon, served with a side of expensive swan meat. In the rare moments they were actually alone, royals often turned to the cabinet of curiosities. These were the precursors to modern museums, private rooms filled with wonders from around the world. A king might spend hours staring at a mermaid's hand, which was usually a monkey's paw sewn to a fishtail, a jar of dragon's blood, red resin, or a collection of misshapen pearls. It was a way for them to feel like they possessed the secrets of the universe. They'd show these things off to visitors as proof of their global reach and intellectual curiosity. It was essentially a physical manifestation of their superstitions, a room where the impossible was made tangible and kept under lock and key. Even their games were weirdly intense. Medieval tennis was nothing like the sport we see today. It was played in enclosed courts and involved hitting a ball of leather and hair against the walls. King James I of Scotland was so fond of the game that he had the windows of his tennis court blocked up because he kept losing his balls. Unfortunately, when assassins came for him later, he tried to escape through the sewers, but he couldn't get out because he had recently blocked the exit to stop his tennis balls from rolling away. It's perhaps the most ironic death in royal history, a man trapped by his own sports equipment. As the candles burn low in our minds, think of these monarchs sitting in their drafty palaces, surrounded by gold and silk, yet constantly on stage. Every dance was a political statement, every hunt was an omen, and every guest was a potential assassin or a bankruptcy risk. Their fun was a heavy, choreographed performance that rarely left room for a simple, quiet breath. They were the most watched people on Earth, yet they lived in a world where almost nothing was as it seemed. Chapter 7: The Whipping Boys and the Gilded Cage of Knowledge. The education of a royal child was less about learning and more about the psychological preparation for becoming a semi-divine entity. From the moment they could sit upright, these toddlers were surrounded by tutors who were often terrifyingly stern and deeply invested in the humoral balance of their pupils. If a young prince was struggling with his Latin, it wasn't because the grammar was hard. It was clearly because his black bile was too thick, or perhaps he had been looking at too many distracting paintings of dogs. But there was a very specific problem when it came to disciplining a future king. You couldn't actually hit him. The person of the monarch, even a pint-sized one, was sacred. To strike the royal body was a form of treason. This led to the creation of one of the most bizarre and tragic roles in the history of education, the whipping boy. This was a child of lower noble birth who was raised alongside the young prince, sharing his lessons and, most importantly, receiving punishments on the prince's behalf.
Alongside the prince as a companion, whenever the prince misbehaved or failed to conjugate a verb or threw a royal tantrum, the tutors wouldn't touch the prince. Instead, they would beat the whipping boy in front of him. The idea was that the prince would feel so much guilt and affection for his friend that he would behave out of a desire to protect him. It was a form of emotional blackmail that was supposed to teach the prince empathy and responsibility. In reality, it probably just created a generation of royal sociopaths who were used to seeing other people suffer for their mistakes. Imagine being that boy, getting a thrashing because a 5-year-old future king decided he didn't like the look of his alphabet blocks today. It's a job description that truly defines the word thankless. The curriculum itself was a strange blend of classical philosophy, military strategy, and a heavy dose of superstitious nonsense. A prince had to learn to write in a noble hand, because a sloppy signature was a sign of a sloppy soul. They were taught to play instruments like the lute, as music was believed to harmonize the mind and keep the passions in check. But they were also taught the science of portents. They were trained to look at a solar eclipse and see not a celestial alignment, but a warning of a coming plague. They were taught that their own bodies were indicators of the nation's health. If the prince had a stomachache, the tutors might look at the political climate of the northern provinces to see where the blockage in the kingdom was occurring. Let's float over to the education of royal girls. While the boys were being taught how to lead armies, or at least how to look good in armor, the princesses were being trained in the art of strategic erasure. They had to be educated enough to hold a conversation with a foreign ambassador, but not so educated that they became troublesome. Their main subjects were needlework, languages, and the highly specialized art of royal silence. They were essentially being prepared to be human peace treaties. Take the case of Lady Jane Grey. She was one of the most brilliant minds of her age, fluent in several languages and obsessed with Greek philosophy. But her education was a nightmare of parental ambition. Her parents were so determined that she should be the perfect, pious candidate for the throne that they would nip and pinch her whenever she didn't meet their impossible standards. She famously said she felt like she was in hell while at home. When she finally did become queen, she only lasted 9 days before being executed. All that brilliance, all those years of study ended on a scaffold because she was just a highly educated pawn in a game played by men who viewed her more as a legal document than a daughter. And then there was the physical toll of being a student king. These children were often deprived of sunlight and fresh air because the court was terrified of them getting sick. While the peasant children were outside developing sturdy immune systems and vitamin D, the royal heirs were kept in drafty, candlelit libraries, wrapped in heavy furs that were likely infested with fleas. They were hothouse flowers in a world that demanded oaks. It's no wonder that so many of them reached adulthood, if they reached it at all, feeling deeply anxious and unprepared for the actual reality of ruling. They had been told their whole lives that they were chosen by God, but they had spent most of their time being taught by men who were terrified of them. It was a bizarre, inverted reality, where the most powerful person in the room was also the most restricted, unable to even make a mistake without someone else feeling the lash. Chapter 8. The Dynastic Marriage Market and the Genetic Roulette. The royal wedding was never about love, it was about the cold, hard geometry of a map. A marriage was a treaty with a veil, a way to secure a mountain pass or a lucrative wool trade without actually having to fire a single arrow. But because the pool of eligible divine blood was so incredibly shallow, these weddings were essentially a game of genetic roulette where the house always won, and the house was usually a very specific branch of the family tree.
When a princess was packed off to a foreign land to marry a man she had only seen in a highly flattering, likely filtered miniature painting, she wasn't just bringing a dowry, she was bringing a payload of recessive traits that were waiting for their moment to shine. It was a form of emotional blackmail that was supposed to teach the prince empathy and responsibility. In reality, it probably just created a generation of royal sociopaths who were used to seeing other people suffer for their mistakes. Imagine being that boy, getting a thrashing because a 5-year-old future king decided he didn't like the look of his alphabet blocks today. It's a job description that truly defines the word thankless. The curriculum itself was a strange blend of classical philosophy, military strategy, and a heavy dose of superstitious nonsense. A prince had to learn to write in a noble hand, because a sloppy signature was a sign of a sloppy soul. They were taught to play instruments like the lute, as music was believed to harmonize the mind and keep the passions in check. But they were also taught the science of portents. They were trained to look at a solar eclipse and see not a celestial alignment, but a warning of a coming plague. They were taught that their own bodies were indicators of the nation's health. If the prince had a stomachache, the tutors might look at the political climate of the northern provinces to see where the blockage in the kingdom was occurring. Let's float over to the education of royal girls. While the boys were being taught how to lead armies, or at least how to look good in armor, the princesses were being trained in the art of strategic erasure. They had to be educated enough to hold a conversation with a foreign ambassador, but not so educated that they became troublesome. Their main subjects were needlework, languages, and the highly specialized art of royal silence. They were essentially being prepared to be human peace treaties. Take the case of Lady Jane Grey. She was one of the most brilliant minds of her age, fluent in several languages and obsessed with Greek philosophy. But her education was a nightmare of parental ambition. Her parents were so determined that she should be the perfect, pious candidate for the throne that they would nip and pinch her whenever she didn't meet their impossible standards. She famously said she felt like she was in hell while at home. When she finally did become queen, she only lasted 9 days before being executed. All that brilliance, all those years of study, ended on a scaffold because she was just a highly educated pawn in a game played by men who viewed her more as a legal document than a daughter. And then there was the physical toll of being a student king. These children were often deprived of sunlight and fresh air because the court was terrified of them getting sick. While the peasant children were outside developing sturdy immune systems and vitamin D, the royal heirs were kept in drafty, candlelit libraries, wrapped in heavy furs that were likely infested with fleas. They were hothouse flowers in a world that demanded oaks. It's no wonder that so many of them reached adulthood, if they reached it at all, feeling deeply anxious and unprepared for the actual reality of ruling. They had been told their whole lives that they were chosen by God, but they had spent most of their time being taught by men who were terrified of them. It was a bizarre, inverted reality, where the most powerful person in the room was also the most restricted, unable to even make a mistake without someone else feeling the lash. Chapter 8: The Dynastic Marriage Market and the Genetic Roulette. The royal wedding was never about love, it was about the cold, hard geometry of a map. A marriage was a treaty with a veil, a way to secure a mountain pass or a lucrative wool trade without actually having to fire a single arrow. But because the pool of eligible divine blood was so incredibly shallow, these weddings were essentially a game of genetic roulette, where the house always won, and the house was usually a very specific branch of the family tree. When a princess was packed off to a foreign land to marry a man she had only seen in a highly flattering, likely filtered miniature painting, she wasn't just bringing a dowry, she was bringing a payload of recessive traits that were waiting for their moment to shine. It was a form of emotional blackmail that was supposed to teach the prince empathy and responsibility. In reality, it probably just created a generation of royal sociopaths who were used to seeing other people suffer for their mistakes. Imagine being that boy, getting a thrashing because a 5-year-old future king decided he didn't like the look of his alphabet blocks today. It's a job description that truly defines the word thankless. The curriculum itself was a strange blend of classical philosophy, military strategy, and a heavy dose of superstitious nonsense. A prince had to learn to write in a noble hand, because a sloppy signature was a sign of a sloppy soul. They were taught to play instruments like the lute, as music was believed to harmonize the mind and keep the passions in check. But they were also taught the science of portents. They were trained to look at a solar eclipse and see not a celestial alignment, but a warning of a coming plague. They were taught that their own bodies were indicators of the nation's health. If the prince had a stomachache, the tutors might look at the political climate of the northern provinces to see where the blockage in the kingdom was occurring. Let's float over to the education of royal girls. While the boys were being taught how to lead armies, or at least how to look good in armor, the princesses were being trained in the art of
The tragic reality was that these royal brides were often just teenagers, sent to live in palaces where they didn't speak the language, surrounded by a court that watched their every move for signs of a pregnancy. If a queen miscarried, it was treated as a spiritual failure. The doctors would blame her for overexcitement, or for eating too many cold foods like melons, or for simply having a rebellious womb. They would subject these grieving women to horrific treatments, drenching them in vinegar, making them swallow crushed emeralds, or forcing them to stay in bed for months in complete darkness. It was a cycle of biological pressure and superstitious cures that turned the royal nursery into a place of profound anxiety rather than joy. And what happened when the children actually arrived? They were immediately handed over to a small army of nurses and governesses, because it was believed that the high-born mother's milk might be too refined or thin for a growing prince. They would search for a wet nurse who was the picture of peasant health, sturdy, cheerful, and definitely not a redhead, as red hair was believed to produce sour milk. It's an amazing irony. The royals were obsessed with their superior blood, yet they insisted their heirs be literally built out of the milk of the common people. As we drift toward the end of our chapter, think of those grand, cold cathedrals where these weddings took place, the smell of incense masking the scent of unwashed silk, the heavy gold crowns pressing on the heads of teenagers who had never met, and the desperate whispered prayers for a boy, any boy, to keep the map from changing color. It was a world where the heart was always a secondary organ to the womb, and where the purity of a lineage was a ghost they chased until it eventually led them into the dark. Chapter 9. The Royal Corpse and the Art of Eternal Dysfunction. In the medieval and early modern world, a king didn't stop being useful just because he had stopped breathing. In fact, for the royal morticians and the superstitious court, the death of a monarch was simply the beginning of a very long, very strange logistical nightmare. The goal was to preserve the royal essence at all costs, which led to the practice of triple internment. They didn't just bury the king, they took him apart. His heart would be placed in one lead casket and sent to a favorite monastery. His entrails would be buried in another location, often where he actually died, and his body, the remaining shell, would be embalmed and sent to the royal mausoleum. The process of embalming was, to put it mildly, an aromatic disaster. Because they lacked modern chemicals, they filled the royal body with a mixture of salt, spices, and heavy resins like frankincense and myrrh. They were essentially trying to turn the monarch into a human piece of potpourri. But sometimes the potpourri didn't hold. There are gruesome accounts of royal funerals where the internal gases of the deceased monarch built up so much that the coffin actually exploded mid-ceremony.
the mourners would be hit with a wave of royal essence that was decidedly less than divine. At the funeral of William the Conqueror, the attendants tried to squeeze his rather large frame into a stone sarcophagus that was too small, and the resulting rupture sent everyone running for the exits, handkerchiefs firmly over their noses. The superstition surrounding the royal body meant that it was almost never left alone. From the moment of death until the final burial, which could take months, death watches were maintained by high-ranking nobles. They believed that if the body was left unguarded, the devil might steal the soul, or worse, someone might steal a piece of the king. Royal body parts were considered ultimate holy relics. If you could get a lock of hair or a finger bone of a particularly saintly king, you basically had a golden ticket to spiritual protection. This made royal funerals a high-security event, with guards protecting the corpse from a public that was a bit too eager for a piece of their ruler. Then there was the tradition of the royal effigy. Because the actual body was often in a state of, let's say, unphotogenic decay, the court would commission a life-sized wax or wooden doll of the monarch. This effigy would be dressed in the king's actual robes, wearing the actual crown, and placed on top of the coffin during the procession. To a distant observer in the crowd, it looked like the king was just sitting there, very still and very pale, taking one last tour of the city. In England, these effigies were kept in Westminster Abbey, and for centuries people would visit them as if they were the kings themselves. It was a way of maintaining the presence of the crown, even after the person wearing it had turned to dust. Even in death, the king's evil persisted. There was a belief that the water used to wash the royal corpse possessed healing properties. People would bribe servants to get a vial of this holy wash water to treat their ailments. It's the ultimate and perhaps most stomach-churning example of how the medieval mind refused to see the monarch as a mere mortal. To them, the king was a bridge between heaven and earth, and even his bath water was a form of medicine. Let's float over to the burial sites themselves. These weren't just graveyards, they were cities of the dead. Kings would spend half their reigns designing their own tombs, ensuring they were surrounded by statues of themselves, looking much younger, thinner, and more heroic than they ever were in life. They wanted to ensure that when the resurrection came, they'd be the first ones out of the ground, looking their absolute best. They'd leave enormous sums of money to monks to sing perpetual masses for their souls, literally paying people to pray for them 24 hours a day forever. Some of these perpetual chants actually lasted for hundreds of years until a later king, usually one who needed the money, came along and shut the monasteries down. As we drift toward the end of our chapter, think of those grand, cold cathedrals where these weddings took place, the smell of incense masking the scent of unwashed silk, the heavy gold crowns pressing on the heads of teenagers who had never met, and the desperate whispered prayers for a boy, any boy, to keep the map from changing color. It was a world where the heart was always a secondary organ to the womb, and where the purity of a lineage was a ghost they chased until it eventually led them into the dark.
The past isn't just a series of dates. It's a long, sleepy story of humans trying their best to make sense of a world they didn't understand, using whatever magical, salty, or golden tools they had at hand. And as the lights dim and the world outside fades away, we can take comfort in the fact that, at the very least, nobody is trying to feed us crushed mummy powder for a headache tonight. Chapter 10. The Twilight of the Gods and the End of the Royal Dream. As we reach the final stretch of our journey tonight, let's look at what happens when these centuries of superstition, inbreeding, and absolute power finally hit the wall of the modern world. There is a specific kind of melancholy in the end of a great dynasty, a twilight of the gods, where all the gold leaf and holy relics in the world couldn't stop the clock. The transition from being a divinely appointed vessel to a mere historical curiosity was rarely a graceful one. It usually involved a lot of confusion, a few tragic trunks of jewelry, and a very sudden realization that the common people had stopped believing in the king's evil. Take the fall of the Bourbons in France. When the revolution finally came for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they didn't exactly make a dash for it. They tried to escape in a vehicle called a berline, which was essentially a massive, slow-moving luxury apartment on wheels. It was loaded with silver dinner services, changes of clothes, and probably a few favorite clocks. They couldn't conceive of a world where they had to move quickly and inconspicuously because they had never not been the center of a slow, ritualized universe. They were caught at Varennes because the king insisted on stopping for a multi-course meal and was recognized because his face was literally on the currency. It's the ultimate irony. The very symbols of his power, the coins in a peasant's pocket, were what led him to the guillotine. Even in their final moments, the old superstitions flickered. On the scaffold, Louis XVI reportedly tried to give a speech about his innocence, but the drums drowned him out. There's a legend that people rushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood, not out of hatred, but because they still believed in the residual power of a king's life force. Even as they were ending the monarchy, they couldn't quite shake the habit of wanting a piece of the relic. It was a messy, transitional moment where the medieval world and the modern world collided in the most violent way possible. And then there are the pretenders, the royals who lost their thrones but kept their titles, wandering through the hotels of Europe like ghosts. They lived in a permanent state of what if. They would hold court in small apartments in London or Paris, surrounded by faded tapestries and loyal servants who were paid in promises. They still practiced the old etiquette, still worried about the purity of their children's marriages, and still consulted the stars for a sign that they would return to their palaces. It was a life of gilded nostalgia, where the weight of the crown was replaced by the weight of a memory. Think of the last of the Stuarts, or the exiled Romanov cousins, or the various kings of Jerusalem who didn't actually have a kingdom to speak of. They became collectors of their own history. They spent their days writing memoirs and their nights dreaming of a world where the humors were still balanced and the evil eye was the biggest threat to their safety. It's a quiet, drifting kind of tragedy, the slow evaporation of a belief system that had sustained empires for 1,000 years. As we finally close our eyes and let the history of these lumpy, anxious, and divinely burdened people fade into the background, we can appreciate the strange beauty of their world. It was a world where a sneeze was a spiritual battle, a horse was a soulmate, and a piece of moss could be medicine. It was a world that was often dark and deeply confusing, but it was never, ever boring. The tapestries are being rolled up now. The candles are being snuffed out by a servant who no longer fears the night hag. The royal lions are sleeping in their cages, and the stars are just stars, silent, distant, and indifferent to the fate of kings. We can leave them all there, tucked away in the dusty corners of the past, and drift off into a sleep that is thankfully free of the pressure of being divine. Chapter 11. The Most Ridiculous Jobs in Medieval History. Since the royal sun has set, let's float over to the people who actually had to make that bizarre world function. If you think your modern office job is tedious, imagine being the person whose entire career was built around the king's bodily functions or the supernatural protection of a village's laundry. In the medieval hierarchy, no task was too small, too gross, or too weird to be turned into a professional title, usually with a fancy-sounding name to make it feel more important. One of the most prestigious and arguably most uncomfortable positions in the English court was the groom of the stool. This wasn't a job for a commoner. It was reserved for the sons of high-ranking nobles. Why? Because the groom of the stool was the person responsible for assisting the king in his most private moments, specifically when he was using the close stool, which was the medieval version of a toilet. While it sounds like a nightmare of hygiene, it was actually a position of immense political power. Because the groom spent so much intimate time with the monarch, he became a trusted confidant. He was the one the king would whisper his secrets to while preoccupied.
To be the groom of the stool was to have the king's ear, quite literally, at his most vulnerable. It was a career built on the proximity of royal plumbing, proving that in the Middle Ages, the path to power often went through the bathroom. Then there was the herb strewer. Since we've established that medieval palaces smelled like a combination of wet dog, old meat, and unwashed velvet, the herb strewer was a vital line of defense. Their job was to walk ahead of the royal procession, throwing handfuls of dried lavender, thyme, and meadowsweet on the floor. The idea was that when the courtiers stepped on the herbs, they would release a pleasant scent to mask the miasma of everyday life. It was a constant losing battle against the laws of chemistry, but it was a job that lasted well into the 19th century. Imagine your entire professional identity being human air freshener. You'd spend your days knee-deep in botanical trimmings, hoping the king didn't walk past the kitchens on a particularly hot afternoon. Let's drift toward the more supernatural career paths. Consider the sin eater we mentioned earlier, but look at it as a professional service. In many villages, this wasn't just a random act, it was a scheduled appointment. The sin eater was a social pariah, a person who lived on the edge of the woods and only appeared when a bell tolled for the dead. They were the ultimate garbage collectors of the soul. For the price of a few coins and a crust of bread, they would take on the spiritual weight of a neighbor's adultery, theft, or general grumpiness. It was a lonely, heavy life, sustained by the belief that someone had to be the sponge for the community's moral failures.
In the world of medieval textiles, there was the fuller. If you've ever wondered how they got wool to be thick and felted, the answer is human urine. Fullers would spend all day standing in large vats filled with stale urine and raw wool, stomping on it with their bare feet. The ammonia in the wash helped to clean the grease out of the wool and thicken the fibers. It was a job you could smell from 2 towns away. Fullers were often required to live in specific districts because nobody wanted to be downwind of the laundry. It's a far cry from the modern delicate cycle, and a reminder that the beautiful tapestries hanging in royal halls were often birthed in a vat of village waste. Speaking of waste, we can't forget the gong farmer. This was a job that could only be done at night by law. A gong farmer was the person responsible for cleaning out the gongs, or cesspits, of the city. They would haul the waste out of the pits and take it to the countryside to be used as fertilizer. It was dangerous, backbreaking, and obviously disgusting work. There are tragic records of gong farmers falling into their workplaces and suffocating. Yet they were surprisingly well paid because, frankly, nobody else would do it. They were the unsung heroes of urban sanitation, working in the dark to keep the miasma at bay, while the rest of the world dreamed of angels and alchemy. As we settle deeper into the quiet of the night, think of these individuals, the grooms, the strewers, the sin eaters, and the gong farmers. Their lives were the grit in the gears of the divine machine. They didn't have gold crowns or pure blood, but they were the ones who actually touched the reality of the medieval world. Their stories are the ones that remind us that history isn't just a series of portraits in a gallery. It's the smell of lavender on a stone floor, the sound of feet stomping in a vat, and the quiet, heavy burden of a shared secret. Chapter 12. The terrifying toolbox of the medieval physician. If the jobs were ridiculous, the tools of the medical trade were borderline nightmarish. Walking into a medieval apothecary or a barber surgeon's shop was like stepping into a room designed by someone who had seen a hardware store in a fever dream but forgot what mercy was. Because they didn't have a concept of germs, and their understanding of anatomy was based on ancient texts and the occasional illegal dissection, their instruments were built for brute force and symbolic alignment rather than precision. One of the most common sights was the clyster. This was essentially a medieval enema pipe, but made of heavy, cold metal or carved bone. It looked like a very long, very unfriendly flute.
Because the humors were often thought to be blocked in the gut, the solution was to flush the system from everything from vinegar to honey to herbal infusions. The most famous patient for this was likely Louis XIV, who reportedly had over 2,000 clysters during his reign. It became such a fashionable procedure in the French court that people would have them while sitting in their parlors, chatting with friends, as if it were nothing more than a casual cup of tea. It was a bizarre blend of extreme discomfort and high society social climbing. Then there was the bloodletting lancet. Since we've talked about the obsession with draining blood, the tool had to be efficient. These were small, sharp blades, often kept in decorative cases. But for those who wanted a more natural approach, there was the leech jar. Leeches were the superstars of the medieval medical world. A doctor would have a jar of these hungry little worms, and he'd place them on specific meridians of your body. The belief was that the leeches would only drink the bad or corrupted blood. It's a nice thought, but in reality, the leeches were just happy to have a snack. They were used for everything from headaches to broken hearts, a sort of biological cure-all that left you feeling faint and slightly slimy. For more specialized work, like the removal of bladder stones, a very common and agonizing ailment due to the lack of clean water, they used something called a lithotome. This was a series of hooks, knives, and dilators designed to fish out the stones. Because there was no anesthesia beyond a stiff drink of ale, or perhaps a bit of mandrake juice, the lithotomist had to be incredibly fast. The goal was to get in and out in under a minute. It was a high-speed, high-stakes surgery that often left the patient in a state of shock, but if you survived, you were considered a walking miracle. Let's float over to the trephine. This was a specialized drill used for trephining, the practice of drilling a hole into a human skull. This wasn't always done for medical reasons, like pressure on the brain. Often it was done for spiritual ones. If someone was acting mad or having seizures, the medieval mind assumed a demon was trapped inside the skull. The hole was essentially an exit door for the devil. Remarkably, archaeological evidence shows that many people actually survived this procedure, as their skulls showed signs of healing. It's a testament to human resilience that people could have a hole bored into their head with a hand-cranked drill and then just go back to their lives, hopefully with fewer demons bothering them. And we can't forget the dental pelican. If you had a toothache in the Middle Ages, you didn't see a dentist, you saw the local blacksmith or the barber. The pelican was a terrifying claw-like instrument that hooked onto the tooth and used leverage against the gum to wrench it out. It usually took a piece of the jawbone with it. Because of the sugar-heavy diet of the elite, tooth extractions were a regular occurrence. Imagine sitting in a barber's chair with the smell of old hair and blood in the air, while a man with very strong forearms approached you with a metal claw. It's no wonder so many royals just let their teeth rot until they turned black. The cure was often scarier than the cavity. As we drift toward the end of our medical tour, think of the wound man. This was a common illustration in medical manuscripts, showing a man covered in every possible injury: arrows, sword cuts, club bruises, and stings. It was a visual guide for the surgeon, showing where to apply different poultices or which tool to use for which wound. The wound man always looked remarkably calm, as if being pierced by a dozen weapons was just a minor inconvenience. It's a perfect symbol of the medieval approach to the body, a resilient, lumpy vessel that could endure almost anything as long as the humors were balanced and the stars were on your side.
The tools of the past are now behind glass in museums, rusted and silent. They remind us of a time when the line between a doctor and a carpenter was very thin, and when the courage to endure the treatment was often greater than the courage to face the disease. We can tuck these sharp, cold thoughts away and sink back into the softness of the modern world, grateful for the silence and the lack of metal pipes in our evening routine. Chapter 13. The most dysfunctional royal siblings and the art of the fratricidal side-eye.
If being a royal child was a gilded cage, being a royal sibling was a high-stakes game of who can survive the family reunion. In the medieval and early modern mindset, having more than one heir was a double-edged sword. You needed an heir and a spare for the stability of the realm, but the spare often spent their entire life looking at the heir and wondering if a well-placed hunting accident or a sudden bout of poisonous mushrooms might change their career trajectory. These weren't just sibling rivalries over who got the biggest piece of cake. These were dynastic meltdowns that could tear entire continents apart. Take, for instance, the sons of William the Conqueror. You'd think that conquering England would be enough to keep a family satisfied, but as soon as the old man was in the ground, after that rather explosive funeral we discussed, his sons, Robert Curthose and William Rufus, turned on each other with the enthusiasm of two cats in a sack. Robert was the eldest, but he was a bit of a wanderer, while William Rufus was the favorite. They spent years raiding each other's lands and trading insults. At one point, their younger brother, Henry, the future Henry I, was just hanging around, waiting for them to finish, eventually snatching the crown when William Rufus was conveniently shot by an arrow in the New Forest while Henry was nearby. Henry didn't even wait for the body to get cold. He rode straight for the treasury. It was a family dynamic based entirely on who had the fastest horse and the least amount of sentimentality. Then we have the classic case of the War of the Roses siblings. The House of York was practically a factory of sibling dysfunction. You had Edward IV, the tall, handsome, and slightly hedonistic king, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. George was the quintessential problem child of the English monarchy. He rebelled against Edward, then joined him, then rebelled again. He was so notoriously unreliable that Edward finally had enough and had him executed. The legend says he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, which is a very specific and somewhat on-brand way for a royal sibling to go out. It's the ultimate snarky end. If you're going to be executed for treason, you might as well choose your favorite vintage for the occasion. Let's float over to the tragic and weird relationship between Queen Elizabeth I and her half-sister Mary I. Talk about a household with a lot of baggage. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the discarded first wife, and Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman who replaced her. When Mary became queen, she spent a good chunk of her reign wondering if she should just go ahead and execute Elizabeth for being a Protestant threat. Elizabeth, for her part, had to play the ultimate game of I'm just a quiet, loyal sister while being held in the Tower of London. They were two women defined by their father's inability to keep a marriage together, and their relationship was a cold, silent war of religious ideology and survival. They were buried together eventually, which is a bit of a final, ironic twist. Two sisters who could barely stand each other in life, now trapped in the same stone monument for eternity. And we can't forget the Ottoman Empire's approach to royal siblings, which was efficient if horrifying. For a long time, the law of the land was royal fratricide. When a new sultan took the throne, he was legally encouraged to execute all of his brothers to prevent civil war. It was a brutal, systematic way of ensuring stability. Imagine the family dinners leading up to the sultan's death, everyone being extra polite because they knew that the moment their father breathed his last, the race to the palace was a matter of life or death. It was the ultimate dark version of musical chairs, where the person without a seat didn't just lose the game, they lost everything. Even when they weren't killing each other, royal siblings were often used as living bargaining chips. A prince might be sent to live as a hostage at a rival court to ensure his brother's good behavior, or a sister would be married off to a man her brother was trying to distract. They were all part of the same genetic brand, but they were rarely on the same team. Their lives were a series of awkward encounters at weddings and funerals, where every hug was a check for a concealed dagger, and every compliment was laced with a bit of, I should be the one wearing that crown. As we settle further into our pillows, think of those long, drafty corridors where these siblings grew up, the whispered conversations in the dark,
the secret alliances made with tutors, and the constant nagging feeling that the person you shared a nursery with might one day be your greatest enemy. It's a reminder that even in the highest circles of power, the most basic human emotions, jealousy, ambition, and fear, were never far from the surface. The royal brothers and sisters of the past are now just names on a genealogy chart, their bitter arguments reduced to a few lines of dry text. We can leave them to their ancient arguments and drift off into a sleep that doesn't require us to look over our shoulder at our own relatives. Chapter 14. The most eccentric royal hobbies and the pursuit of gilded boredom. When a royal wasn't busy dodging an ambitious sibling or trying to figure out if their liver was phlegmatic, they often fell into the trap of having too much time and way too much money. This led to the development of hobbies that were less about relaxation and more about obsessively pursuing things that made everyone around them very, very confused. Because when you're a monarch, nobody can tell you that your collection of clockwork ducks or your obsession with giant soldiers is a bit weird. They just have to stand there and nod while you explain the finer points of your latest fixation.
Take, for instance, King Louis XVI. While the French Revolution was brewing and the peasants were getting restless about the price of bread, Louis wasn't necessarily plotting grand political maneuvers. He was usually in his workshop, obsessed with locksmithing. He loved locks. He loved the way they clicked, the intricate mechanisms of the tumblers, and the sheer predictability of a well-made key. There's something deeply ironic about a man who was essentially a prisoner of his own courtly ritual, spending his free time perfecting the very devices used to keep things shut. He'd spend hours filing down iron, his hands covered in grease, much to the horror of his more refined courtiers. He was a man who wanted to solve puzzles that actually had answers, unlike the crumbling finances of France. Then we have King Frederick William I of Prussia, a man who took hobby to a level of military obsession that was frankly a bit unsettling. He didn't just like soldiers, he liked tall soldiers. He created a regiment known as the Potsdam Giants. To get into this elite unit, you had to be over 6 feet tall, which in the 18th century made you a literal giant. He would go to extraordinary lengths to recruit these men, sometimes kidnapping them from other countries or offering immense sums to their families. He didn't even want them to fight, he just wanted to watch them march. He'd have them parade through his bedroom when he was sick to cheer himself up. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists.
While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and intricate mechanical toys. He'd spend days ignoring his ministers to watch a bird made of gold flap its wings. It was essentially a living collection of action figures, curated with a level of intensity that suggested the king was perhaps a few humors short of a balanced mind. Let's float over to the world of royal alchemists. While some kings collected locks or tall men, others, like Emperor Rudolph II, collected everything else. Rudolph turned his palace in Prague into a haven of occultists, astronomers, and charlatans. He was obsessed with finding the Monas Hieroglyphica and understanding the hidden laws of the universe. He had a Kunstkammer, a room filled with things like the jawbone of a mermaid, likely a manatee, unicorn horns, and
Then there were the health spas. If a royal was feeling a bit congested or their gout was acting up, they would head to places like Bath or Spa. The idea was to take the waters, which involved either sitting in a giant communal stone tub filled with lukewarm mineral water or, even worse, drinking it. The water often smelled like rotten eggs, a sure sign of healing minerals, according to the doctors. You'd have a dozen dukes and duchesses all soaking together in a sulfur-scented soup, discussing the latest scandals while their skin turned a delicate shade of wrinkled gray. It was the height of fashion, but it was also a fantastic way to spread whatever skin condition the Earl of Sussex had brought with him from London. Let's float over to the sea bathing craze. By the time of King George III, doctors decided that the cold, salty ocean was the cure for everything, from melancholy to indigestion. The king would go to Weymouth and be wheeled into the sea in a bathing machine, basically a wooden hut on wheels. As the king dipped into the freezing English Channel, a band on the shore would play God Save the King. Imagine trying to maintain your royal dignity while shivering in a wet woolen tunic while a tuba player blares an anthem at you from the beach. It was a miserable, cold, and profoundly loud way to spend a holiday, but George loved it. He'd come out of the water blue-lipped and shivering, convinced he was the picture of health. And what about the diplomatic hunting trips? These were the vacations where you were supposed to be making friends with neighboring kings, but usually just ended up arguing over who shot which deer. They would set up elaborate tent cities in the woods, filled with silk hangings and silver plate, trying to pretend they were roughing it up. Of course, roughing it up still involved a 10-course meal and a bed with a goose-down mattress. The irony was that they spent so much time and effort trying to bring the palace to the woods that they never actually got to enjoy the nature they were supposed to be visiting. They just stayed in a canvas version of their own living rooms, complaining about the mosquitoes.
As we drift into the final quiet moments of our long historical monologue, think of those heavy carriages rattling along the cobblestones, the tired horses, the dusty velvet curtains, and the young princes staring out the window, wondering if they're ever going to get to a place where the water doesn't smell like eggs. Their vacations weren't about getting away from it all. They were about carrying it all across a continent that was largely indifferent to their comfort. The roads are quiet now. The bathing machines have all been hauled back to the sheds, and the sulfur water has finally gone cold. We can leave the royal travelers to their bumpy journeys and settle into a bed that, unlike theirs, doesn't require a team of 16 horses to move. I hope these stories have been sufficiently boring and mildly interesting enough to guide you into a deep, dreamless sleep. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 16, perhaps exploring the most unfortunate royal wardrobe malfunctions that occurred during these travels? Or perhaps it's time to let the library lights fade to black. Chapter 16. The most unfortunate royal wardrobe malfunctions and the tyranny of velvet. When your entire identity is built on being a divinely appointed symbol of the state, your clothes aren't just fashion, they're a heavy, itchy, and often dangerous architectural project. Medieval and Renaissance royals didn't get dressed, they were assembled. They were layers upon layers of stiffened linen, whalebone stays, lead-based face paint, and yards of heavy velvet that hadn't seen a washing machine since the Crusades. Because looking like a king was more important than being able to breathe or move, the history of royal wardrobes is essentially a long list of people sweating, tripping, and occasionally catching fire in the name of prestige. Take the farthingale. This was a hoop skirt designed to give women a bell-like shape, often made of willow wood or whalebone. It made the wearer so wide that they couldn't walk through a standard door without turning sideways. There are accounts of royal ladies getting stuck in narrow palace corridors, requiring a team of servants to basically unwedge them. And because these hoops were so cumbersome, sitting down was a tactical maneuver. If you sat down too quickly, the front of the skirt would fly up in a way that was decidedly not divine. It was a fashion choice that turned every room into a potential obstacle course. Then there was the codpiece. For the men of the Tudor era, this was the ultimate statement of virility and status. It started as a practical bit of fabric to cover a gap in the hosen, but because why stop at practical, it evolved into a giant, padded, and often bejeweled protrusion. Henry VIII was the king of the oversized codpiece. He had them padded with cotton and decorated with embroidery to ensure that everyone knew he was a man of great potential. The problem was, of course, that it made sitting at a table or mounting a horse incredibly awkward. It was a piece of clothing that demanded its own zip code, and it often led to some very snarky whispered commentary from foreign ambassadors who had to keep a straight face while talking to the king's waistline. Let's float over to the ruff. In the late 16th century, the ruff was the height of sophistication. It was a circular, pleated collar made of lace and stiffened with starch. The bigger the ruff, the higher your status. Eventually, they became so large, called cartwheel ruffs, that the wearer couldn't see their own feet. It forced the head to stay in a fixed upright position, which gave the royals a very haughty look, but mostly because they literally couldn't look down. Eating became a nightmare. They had to use specially designed long-handled spoons just to get soup past the lace barrier. One spilled drop of broth could ruin a piece of lace that cost more than a peasant's cottage. It was a fashion that turned the human head into a decorative plate. And we can't forget the lead makeup. To achieve the ghostly pale look that suggested you never had to work in the sun, royals would douse themselves in ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. It gave them a smooth porcelain finish, but it also slowly ate away at their skin and caused their hair to fall out. To hide the damage, they would apply even more lead. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly had a layer of makeup so thick that it would crack when she smiled. It was a literal mask of power, a toxic shell that kept the world from seeing the very human decay beneath the Gloriana persona. Imagine the smell of vinegar and lead mixing with the heavy perfumes of the court. It was a scent of high-stakes vanity.
The wardrobe malfunction reached its peak with the invention of the pantaloon and the justacorps. In the 18th century, men's fashion became obsessed with being tight. Trousers were so snug that men had to be literally sewn into them by their valets. If a prince ate a particularly large meal or took a sudden step, the seams would give way with a sound that could be heard across the ballroom. There are records of noblemen having to spend entire parties standing perfectly still against a wall because their breeches had surrendered to the pressure of a single bow. It was a life lived on the edge of a tailor's stitch. As we drift into the final quiet moments of our long, velvet-soaked journey, think of those grand portraits in the galleries. The kings in their padded doublets, the queens in their cartwheel ruffs, and the princes in their bejeweled codpieces. They look so still, so permanent, and so regal. But now we know the truth. They were probably itchy, they definitely couldn't see their toes, and they were all just one deep breath away from a very public, very undivine rip in the fabric. The wardrobes are all empty now. The moths have had their way with the velvet, and the starch has long since turned to dust. We can leave the royals to their heavy, beautiful, and deeply uncomfortable clothes and settle into a sleep that allows for the ultimate luxury, a pair of soft pajamas and the freedom to move as much as we want. I hope these tales of royal fashion disasters have been the perfect, boring lullaby for your evening. If you're still with me, perhaps tomorrow we'll explore the most boring royal diaries ever written. But for now, let's just let the silence be our final layer. Good night. Chapter 17. The Most Boring Royal Diaries and the Art of the Mundane Monarchy. When we think of the private writings of kings and queens, we often imagine scandalous secrets, whispered betrayals, or grand philosophical musings on the nature of power. We expect, "Today I decided the fate of empires," but the reality is usually closer to, "Today I had a slightly overboiled egg and the wind was coming from the east." Because when your life is an endless parade of ritual and paperwork, the most exciting thing that can happen is a change in the weather or a particularly satisfying bowel movement. Royal diaries are, for the most part, a masterclass in the profoundly uninteresting, which makes them the perfect companion for our journey into sleep. Take, for instance, the diaries of King Louis XVI, the man who, as we've discussed, preferred his locks to his laws. On July 14, 1789, a day that most history books consider fairly significant because a little thing called the Bastille was being stormed, Louis sat down to record his thoughts. His entry for that monumental, world-changing day was a single word: rien, nothing. Now, to be fair, he was referring to his hunting bag. He hadn't managed to shoot any deer that day. But it's the ultimate example of royal tunnel vision. While the foundations of the monarchy were being dismantled by a Parisian mob, the king was genuinely bummed out about his lack of venison. It's a diary entry that captures the sheer, flat boredom of a man who was psychologically incapable of realizing he was in a revolution. Then there is Queen Victoria, who was a prolific journaler. She wrote millions of words over the course of her life, and while some are deeply moving, a vast majority are a meticulous record of what people wore and what the temperature was in the Highlands. You can read pages and pages of Victoria describing the exact shade of blue of a lady-in-waiting sash, or the specific way the fog rolled over Balmoral. She would record the arrival and departure of every minor German prince with the precision of a train conductor. Dear Albert looked well in his gray trousers. We walked. It drizzled. We had tea.
It's a rhythmic domestic litany that turns the most powerful woman in the world into a very dedicated secretary of her own life. It's comforting, in a way, to know that even at the height of the British Empire, the Queen spent a significant amount of time thinking about her socks. Let's float over to the diaries of Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. Nicholas was a man who famously loved his family and his garden far more than he loved the bureaucracy of the Kremlin. His diaries are a soothing, if slightly tragic, record of a man who just wanted to be a country gentleman. Even as the Russian Empire was beginning to fracture, Nicholas would record his daily walks and the number of crows he had shot. Walked for a long time, killed 2 crows, had tea with Alex. It's a repetitive, almost meditative loop. He records the weather, the health of his children, and the pleasantness of the afternoon sun, while the telegrams from his ministers, filled with news of strikes and unrest, remained, one assumes, in a very neat pile on his desk. It's the diary of a man who was trying to hold back the tide with a teacup. And what about the medieval commonplace books? These weren't diaries in the modern sense, but collections of bits and pieces that interested the noble owner. You'll find a prayer to Saint Sebastian, followed immediately by a recipe for ale pottage, and then perhaps a drawing of a particularly interesting-looking turnip. They are the scrapbooks of a mind that viewed the world as a giant, jumbled collection of omens and lunch options. There is no drama, no overarching narrative, just the slow, steady accumulation of the mundane. Bought 3 chickens. The priest has a cold. Rain again. It's the background noise of history, the hum of a life lived one small, unremarkable day at a time. Even the court circulars, the official records of what the royals were doing, read like a sedative. There are lists of names, titles, and locations. The king received the ambassador of Venice. The queen walked in the garden. The prince practiced his lute. It's a world where every action is scheduled and every moment is observed, leaving no room for the unexpected. It's a history stripped of its peaks and valleys, reduced to a long, flat plain of protocol. As we drift into the final quiet moments of our evening, think of all those pens scratching away on parchment and paper. The thousands of royal hands recording the thousands of teas they drank and the thousands of times it rained. Their diaries aren't a window into their souls. They're a record of their endurance against the crushing weight of their own boredom. They survived the spectacle by focusing on the small stuff, the eggs, the crows, and the gray trousers. The ink has dried on the pages now. The diaries are all closed and tucked away in the archives. We can leave the monarchs to their meticulous records and settle into a sleep that doesn't require us to write down a single thing. We don't have to account for the weather, or the tea, or the color of our sashes. We can just be.
Chapter 19. The most ridiculous royal gifts and the diplomacy of the white elephant. When a royal needed to impress a neighbor, they didn't just send a nice card or a basket of muffins. They sent things that were designed to be so expensive, so rare, and so incredibly inconvenient that the receiver would be forced to spend a fortune just to keep the gift alive or properly housed. This was the arms race of royal generosity, a world where a gift was often a thinly veiled threat to your bank account. If a king sent you a leopard, he wasn't just saying, "I like you." He was saying, "I am so wealthy I can ship a predatory cat across a continent, and now you have to figure out how to feed it without it eating your children." The ultimate example of this, of course, is the literal white elephant. In Southeast Asian courts, particularly in Siam, the white elephant was a sacred symbol of royal power. If a king wanted to subtly ruin a courtier he disliked, he would give them a white elephant as a gift. Because the animal was sacred, it couldn't be put to work, and it had to be kept in absolute luxury, often involving gold-trimmed harnesses and a diet of the finest fruits. The cost of maintaining the elephant would eventually bankrupt the recipient. It was the perfect, polite, and completely devastating royal prank.
Let's float over to the European version of this, the Habsburg menagerie exchanges. When the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II wanted to impress the Spanish court, he decided to send an elephant named Solomon from Lisbon to Vienna. This was in 1551. Imagine being a peasant in the Alps and seeing a 3-ton gray beast walking past your farm while a group of confused Portuguese handlers tried to keep it from eating the local hayloft. Solomon became a celebrity, but he was also a logistical nightmare. Every city he passed through had to build special bridges and provide massive amounts of food. The gift wasn't just the elephant, it was the spectacle of the struggle to move it. Then there were the clockwork automata. In the 18th century, the ultimate flex was to send a mechanical marvel. The King of England once sent the Emperor of China a clock that featured a small mechanical bird that sang and a tiny waterfall made of spinning glass. These gifts were intended to show off Western science, but the Chinese court often viewed them as amusing toys rather than signs of superiority. There was a profound, silent cultural gap where one side thought they were sending a masterpiece of engineering, and the other side thought they were receiving a very loud and slightly distracting paperweight. We can't forget the relic diplomacy. In the Middle Ages, the most valuable gift you could give was a piece of a saint. A king might send another king a tooth, a thumb, or a fragment of a cloak. To us, it sounds a bit like a horror movie prop, but to them, it was a spiritual nuclear deterrent. By giving away a piece of a saint, you were sharing the divine protection of your kingdom. Of course, the authenticity of these relics was always a bit flexible. There were enough pieces of the true cross circulating in Europe to build a fleet of ships, but that didn't stop royals from trading them like high-stakes baseball cards. And then there were the people as gifts. We've touched on the court dwarves and fools, but they were often traded between courts as if they were prize horses. Catherine de' Medici was known to exchange her favorites with other European queens. It's a tragic, uncomfortable reality of the time that people with physical differences were treated as curiosities to be gifted and displayed. It was a world where a person's value was tied to how much they could entertain or balance the superstitions of the palace. As we drift into the final quiet moments of our evening, think of those strange caravans moving across the borders, the elephants shivering in the cold, the mechanical birds chirping in their velvet boxes, and the golden plows being polished for their next symbolic furrow. These gifts were the physical manifestations of royal ego, expensive, beautiful, and almost entirely useless. The roads are quiet now. The elephants are long gone, and the clockwork birds have finally wound down. We can leave the white elephants of history in their gilded stables and settle into a sleep that doesn't require us to maintain any more than our own peaceful breathing. Chapter 20. The most disastrous royal deaths and the inelegant exit. As we reach the quiet final corridor of our long journey, we must look at the way these figures finally left the stage. For a group of people who spent every waking second obsessing on their divine image, their deaths were often remarkably, and quite ironically, human. There's a certain dry, historical humor in the fact that you can be the master of a continent, yet your final moment is dictated by a bad piece of fruit, a stubborn horse, or a poorly timed snack. The divine right of kings usually turned out to be no match for the mundane laws of biology and gravity. Take the case of King William the Conqueror. After a life of brutal warfare and intense political maneuvering, the man who reshaped England met his end not on a glorious battlefield, but because his horse stumbled. He was thrown against the pommel of his saddle, causing internal injuries that were made much worse by his significant royal girth. As we've mentioned, his funeral was a disaster of olfactory proportions, but his actual passing was just as awkward. He died in a monastery, and as soon as he breathed his last, his attendants, the very people who had bowed to him for decades, proceeded to loot the room. They took the linens, the gold, and even the king's clothes, leaving the conqueror lying nearly naked on the floor. It was a very sudden, very cold reminder that power only exists as long as the heart is beating. Then there was King Henry I, William's son, famously died of a surfeit of lampreys. Lampreys are jawless, eel-like fish that were considered a high-status delicacy, despite looking like something from a nightmare. Henry's doctors had specifically told him to stop eating them because they were heavy on his humors. But Henry, being a king, decided that he knew better than his medical staff. He ate a massive bowl of them against orders, developed a severe case of
food poisoning, and died a few days later. It's a very specific way to go. The man who solidified the English legal system defeated by a bowl of prehistoric-looking fish. It's the ultimate snarky historical footnote. He survived rebellions and wars, only to be taken down by a snack. Let's float over to the French king, Charles VIII, known as Charles the Affable. Charles was walking to a tennis match, once again that dangerous sport, and was in such a hurry to get to the court that he forgot he was quite tall. He slammed his forehead into a low stone lintel in a doorway. He brushed it off at first, watched the game, and then suddenly collapsed and died. He was 27 years old. To spend your life surrounded by guards and advisors, only to be defeated by a piece of stationary architecture, is a level of irony that even the best medieval poets couldn't invent. It makes you realize why so many kings were so paranoid about their horoscopes. They were looking for stars when they really should have been looking at the height of the door frames. And what about King George II of Great Britain? His end was perhaps the most relatable, if slightly undignified, of all. He died while sitting on the close stool in the morning. He had woken up, had his cup of chocolate, and went to perform his daily royal duty when his heart simply gave out. There's something strangely humanizing about it. Despite all the velvet, the crowns, and the national anthems, the King of Great Britain and Ireland and Elector of Hanover ended his journey in the one place where everyone, regardless of bloodline, is truly equal. Then there are the mournful deaths, like that of Queen Anne of Great Britain. She had endured 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in an heir who survived to adulthood. By the time she was dying, she was so swollen with gout and dropsy that she had to be moved around her palace in a specialized hoist. Her death was a long, slow fade, a quiet ending to a tragic personal life that had been lived entirely for the sake of a succession that never happened. The doctors tried their usual tricks, blistering her skin and giving her garlic poultices, but she eventually just slipped away, leaving the throne to a distant German cousin who couldn't even speak English. As we settle into the final, deepest layer of our rest, think of these monarchs in their final moments. The conqueror on the floor, Henry with his eels, Charles with his doorway, and George on his stool. They were the most powerful people on the planet, yet they were ultimately subject to the same small, weird, and often messy endings as the rest of us. The spectacle of their lives was over, and the rien of history was waiting for them. The great hall is dark now. The last of the lampreys have been cleared away, the door frames have been noted, and the royal hoist has been put into storage. We can leave the monarchs to their final quiet exits and drift off into a sleep that is peaceful, dignified, and entirely our own.